Hello and welcome to this wonderful keynote session for River Rally 2021. That music we were just listening to, I think, is very fitting for our next guest. It definitely takes a higher love to do what Catherine Coleman Flowers has been doing for her entire life, and especially these last 20 years, where she has been deep into some rather unpleasant matters that are the realities of much of America. I first met Catherine Coleman Flowers 6 years ago after a colleague forwarded to me a news clip from Al Jazeera English News featuring Catherine Coleman Flowers and the work that she was doing. I was doing some research for a project on the connection between water and health in the United States. And, I wasn't unfamiliar with sewage problems. After all, I had spent a number of years earlier for a riverkeeper organization where I was suing over sewage overflows. I knew of cities in the United States, cities with names that you've heard of, where school kids were routinely having to walk through floodwaters tainted with sewage, as they were coming home from school. At Raleigh years earlier, I had met a guy from West Virginia who had helped his small mountain community eliminate the straight pipes that were carrying untreated toilet water down their communal stream. But despite all of that, I was not prepared for what Catherine Coleman Flowers shared with me in the hour she gave me back in 2015. It's not a conversation that one quickly forgets, or if ever forgets, and I don't think you will forget today's session either. Catherine is a child of Alabama. She was born in Birmingham and raised in rural Lowndes County, which is part of the Black Belt that cuts across the deep South in the US. She's a veteran of the US Air Force. She's the founder of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise, which is now the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. There's lots more, but the two other highlights I want to include here is last year was a pretty big year for Catherine. She was recognized as a MacArthur Fellow, one of the highest awards that I can imagine. And she also released her book, long in the making, Waste, One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. Let's see if I can get that in the screen. And Catherine, when I see you next, I'm going to get you to autograph this for me. One thing that we can't do virtually yet. And I hope that all of you, if you haven't gotten your hands on that book yet, please do so. You will not regret it. I found her personal journey as a civil rights activist, which then led to her unlikely role as a sewage and poverty activist, to be just absolutely captivating. The story is interesting in and of itself, but I also think there are lessons in it for all of us. And three that I took away was, one, this work takes time. It takes a lot of time, decades of time, and don't let that discourage you. You just, that the proverbial journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. It all adds up eventually. And I think that at this point, Catherine is really able to see the impact of her work, not just in Alabama, but nationally and even globally. Another point is to be open to unlikely partners, including those who you think may not share your political point of view, and you just don't know where those are going to lead, and keep those doors open. And then a third takeaway that I thought really would resonate with this audience is that anyone with heart and determination can keep at it and make a difference, including a country girl from the heart of the Black Belt. And so in a second, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking her. But first, we are going to have time for discussion. So start getting your questions ready. I am sure you will have them, and put them into the chat. And I'll try to pick some of those to share with Catherine after she makes some initial remarks. So please join me in thanking my friend and colleague, Catherine Coleman Flowers. Look forward to seeing what you have to share with us today.
Thank you, Lynn. Wow, this has been quite an eventful period of time, and who would have thought that there would be so many people talking about waste, especially many years ago when I was told that this was not a sexy subject and no one would be interested in it. But it is something that we all share in common. And one of the things that I've learned as a country girl is to try to find out about those things that we share in common, to find ways to bridge these gaps and not focus on the things that are different as much. And that's why we have the turmoil that we have in the world today, instead of looking at those things that we all share and we must all be concerned about. And one of the things that COVID has taught us this year is that we are, in fact, our neighbor's keeper. So when I talk about rivers today and I talk about my experiences, I'm going to be coming from that perspective. And I know you didn't expect to hear a speech about faith, but I think we can't talk about uh, rivers and not talk about that, because if rivers could speak, rivers have been a part of so many different aspects of our cultures throughout the world. And still very much an important part of that is we deal with climate change and climate justice. We also have to deal with the justice as it relates to rivers. And one of the things that I want you to take away from what I have to say today is that inequality also impacts rivers too, because that's where it ends up ultimately. So I want to start just by giving you a little bit about my background. As Lynn said, first of all, I want to thank her for the introduction. And I would like to thank the River Network for inviting me to come and give this keynote today. The River Network we've been partners and working together for a number of years since we came across each other's paths, because our work is very complementary and we have to be engaged and collaborate in order to find these long-term solutions. But last year, when I was a part of this event, we were talking about the uncertainty that we were dealing with, and the fact that we were all, in the throes of a pandemic that we did not understand, and at the same time, our country was in upheaval, dealing with issues of social justice, and we were trying to figure out how do we get to another place. And clearly, I think for all of us, we had to reflect and go back to what was familiar. And for me, it was my background. Growing up in rural Lowndes County, we were to a degree, sometimes in rural communities, you can be a little bit isolated from everybody else. Our connection to the world was television. Generally, I learned the new dances by watching Soul Train, and my aspiration as a kid at one point was to go to California to become a Soul Train dancer. But those were things that imagination and learning about nature kind of kept me grounded. And I found the same thing to be true last year as we dealt with this pandemic and trying to figure out a way forward out of all of the different crises that seemed to converge at the same time. And as a person growing up in rural communities, one of the things I've learned that has been very helpful to me even now, and I often tell people this when we talk about how do we bridge these gaps and how do we save the things that are very important to us, like rivers. And one of the things we have to do is listen, because even the rivers have a story. We have to listen. We have to learn community engagement. We have to learn how to sit down with folks. One of the things about being on a riverbank is that you get a chance to either sit in solitude, or sometimes you get a chance to meet people, because that's the one thing that you have in common. It's the fact that you love that river and what it brings. And rivers, in terms of history, have always been very important. When I taught American history to my students, especially my junior high school students who could not understand why it was relevant to their lives, I had to explain to them that the river were the highways of the country at the time, and that's how people got from place to place, or even took goods from one place to the other. And that's why people settled where they settled. And now we have to be concerned about rivers because of contamination and the destruction of rivers. And there's even conversations now about rivers having rights. And if we gave rivers the same kind of rights that we gave corporations, we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we're having now, I would say, with climate change and climate justice. It's also very important as we talk about rivers and faith. Growing up in Lowndes County, it was a community that was driven by faith. One of the things that brought us together was going to to church, or actually going to, in my case, walking to Sunday school. I had to walk because we didn't have public transportation. And I walked with a group of young people from my community, and we would walk to the church every Sunday to learn lessons that I use today. And part of that, for a lot of young people that were in church in Lowndes County at that time, part of the ceremony of accepting one's faith was a baptism, and the baptism generally took place in a river, or the baptism would take place in a body of water. So rivers have always been very, very important to our culture. And if we go back in history and look at even the history of Montgomery, Alabama, which was founded on the Alabama River, and the Alabama River was very, very instrumental in a lot of ways. But the Equal Justice Initiative, which is where I also work, is located not very far from the Alabama River in Montgomery. And if you ever get a chance to visit, and this is going to be a shameless pitch, but please visit the National Memorial of Peace and Justice at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, if you can, because it tells a lot of stories about our history as a nation, and it helped, I think, point the way to what we need to do as it relates to social justice. But it's not very far from the Alabama River. The building where the Equal Justice Initiative is located was once a slaveholding pen, because people, when they ended the importation of slaves in the Constitution from other countries, they had a thriving domestic slave trading market in Montgomery, Alabama. And one of the reasons why it thrived was because of the railroad and the river. So the river, if the river could speak, the river would have a lot of stories to tell. There is a song by the Snake Freedom Singers about the Mississippi River. And they talk about in the Mississippi River, if the people whose bodies were thrown there could get out and walk, if they could walk one by one and two by two, it talks about how many days the people would be walking that were in the Mississippi River. And today we're not necessarily contaminated with the bodies of people that we don't respect, but we're contaminating it with trash, we're contaminating it with wastewater, we're contaminated with all of these things that we don't want to see anymore. And we think if we dispose of it in the river, it will be gone, and it's not. And one of the stories that I read recently was about a body of water in Florida that's suffering from this massive algae bloom, and they're afraid that if it's released, how it can end up contaminating other bodies of water. And that struck with me because I know that algae blooms can be or fed by a lot of what comes out in waste. And I know that in the state of Florida, for an example, septic systems are failing. And they're failing around the United States. And a lot of people are pretending like that is not a problem, but it is a problem. And what we're going to have to do is deal with our current realities as it relates to waste and wastewater and how we treat it. There is, we're actually, my organization, the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, is engaged in a project, a year-long project with the Guardian. And we're actually documenting wastewater problems across the US because the government has no clear figures. If you go from state to state, what you're going to find is that they have a different process of determining, first of all, who does not have wastewater infrastructure, who has a failing on-site wastewater infrastructure, and the third problem are wastewater treatment systems that are also failing. And what we were surprised to find is how many places around the US are now starting to deal with wastewater and infrastructure problems. It's a larger problem that people realize, and we're going to have to really find a way in which we can address this issue, because the infrastructure that was not designed to deal with climate change or climate justice. I also think that part of the engineering paradigm, which is a failure, is that when people try to find solutions, they generally go to politicians who are not living with the problem, and they leave out the people that are living with this problem, who may have some solutions that could work. They just don't have the credentials to get the attention or the money. And oftentimes we end up well-intended consequences oftentimes reinforce historical infrastructures that are are racist in nature or promote inequality. For an example, here in the city of Montgomery, we have found out that there are communities that are on septic systems, and these are all Black communities. A lot of these communities are low-lying. A lot of these communities, it floods every time it rains, and it's starting to flood even more because we're getting even more rain. NOAA just released a report saying that there's going to be more rainfall in the east. That means that there's going to be more flooding in these low-lying areas. And these septic systems simply don't work. I was called to the site of a home 2 weeks ago where the septic system had failed. Actually, when the company went to look at the system, they removed the top and broke it. So now it's exposed and open. They told the homeowner there would be anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000 to fix it. Yet what we found in the city of Montgomery is that the people that are on septic system are mostly African American. With the project that we have with the Guardian, a lot of the people that are reporting wastewater problems are people of color or people from marginalized or poor communities. This needs to stop because ultimately all of this ends up in a river somewhere. And that's why we have the algae blooms. That's why we have the fish kills. And at some point, if we kill the rivers, we're killing ourselves because they're part of our survival. And we have to find a way in which we can address this. And I'm getting to the point now that when I talk about this issue, that I want people to understand the connection between racism and inequality also impacts our water. You know, we saw that at Standing Rock. We see that's happening right now in Memphis, where there's a fossil fuel company that wants to build a pipeline through an aquifer that provides water for 1 million people. We have to be concerned about climate change and climate justice. And finally, I would like to talk a little bit about my role on the WEJAC. The WEJAC is the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is the first of its kind, where President Biden has appointed me one of the 2 vice chairs of the WEJAC. And our goal is to look at environmental justice issues around the country and to look at how federal agencies can look at climate change and how it manages programs through a lens of environmental justice. And I think we need to have an environmental justice program for rivers too, because rivers have been the unlikely beneficiary of all of the wrongs and ills of our choices that we've made as societies in terms of how we deal with waste and how we deal with the unintended consequences of siting plants on rivers and dumping the remains there, where there's some people like in North Carolina dealing with PFAS contamination and other types of contamination all around the United States and around the world because of our inability to respect nature and to respect rivers. When I went to Standing Rock, one of the most important things I took away from there, I remember going down to the river one morning because all of our ceremonies happened at the river. And while we were at the river, we all walked, first of all, as we descended down to the river, because there was an incline, people were helping us ascend to the river. And the people that led the ceremony were river walkers and water walkers, and they had gone and collected water from around the world. And we were giving honor to the river because the river brings forth life. And of course, we know that water is life. And without water, none of us could live. And I left there with a deep respect, a very deep respect for rivers and the stories that they could tell. And we could just, I think in our listening process, if we just stop and listen to the rivers. And sometimes I go to the Alabama River here, and there's a place there called Holy Ground. And when I first learned about Holy Ground many, many years ago, I didn't even realize my own heritage was tied to Holy Ground, because Holy Ground was one of those places where Native peoples gathered in this area to resist settlers coming to take their land. And it was a community that had it was a community of Creeks who settled with African Americans. And they were fighting against the military who was sent into this area. And Holy Ground is in Lowndes County, Alabama, which is where I'm from. And I didn't realize when I first went to Holy Ground for a ceremony, that I actually had relatives whose blood had run on the ground there at Holy Ground. I didn't know that at the time. I found it out after doing a lot of genealogical study, but I was always really deeply connected to Holy Ground and connected to that point at the Alabama River, even got married there on that particular site, not knowing any of these connections. And before I became as deeply involved as an environmentalist as I am now. So in learning about this history, one of the things that I learned is that they settled there on that river and they formed this village. And Andrew Jackson was called in to put down their resistance. And out of that was formed the America's Indian removal policy, because a lot of the people were then removed from the South to the West. And so the indigenous history and respect for nature, as well as my own African indigenous history, teaches me that we have to be respectful of water, and we have to be respectful of rivers, because rivers have a story. And of all of these, just imagine if we went and collected all the stories of the rivers. And I think that will help other people to understand how important and vital that they are, that we have to stop contaminating, because once we cut off the lifeblood of the rivers, we're cutting off our own lifeblood. And I am going to stop here because I wanted to give you an opportunity to engage and ask questions, and hopefully out of some of this could come some action items for what we can do to make sure that we protect our rivers, other than telling the stories of the rivers themselves. Thank you.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much. I mean, I know that's just the tip of the iceberg compared to your experiences, and I really appreciate it, especially these stories of the rivers and the people whose blood has been in the rivers, and the connection to faith. I wasn't baptized in a river, but I would always see people getting baptized in my local river, and it was very intriguing to me. Let me transition though. Is it going to feel like a 90-degree turn to go from those very personal roles of rivers in our lives to a really practical question that came up in the chat here. You in your writings have talked a lot about, and something that I think many of us haven't really thought about until recently. You know, the U.S., there's a lot of investment in infrastructure in our country, including in water infrastructure, but that tends to go to a city, sort of centralized sewage treatment. And the people who are either in really small communities or on septic are left out of that federal investment, and even the state investment for the most part. So here we are now with all this talk about infrastructure, likely to have billions of dollars invested in it. It's still not going to be enough to go around. But what kind of recommendations do you have for that investment and for the work that we can do in terms of advocating for its allocation to be more equitable than what has happened in the past?
Well, I think the first thing is that those places like Montgomery, Alabama, that have a working sewer system, expand it to everybody, not just to businesses, because the current paradigm is, when we had the conversation with the people from the Water and Sewer Board, their position was, we don't build sewers anymore. If the developers didn't build a sewer, then we're not going to put it there. It's up to the community to do it. Well, in that case, then what happens is that it reinforced these racist structures that were informed by racial covenants, where only people could live, you could only buy land in certain areas, and it wasn't the best areas of the town. And those are also the areas where people are on septic systems. So that's the first thing we can do. Where there are working systems, let's expand them to include people in the county. And I've seen them do it because I did economic development first. So I saw them do it for Hyundai when Hyundai came here, and it was put in a pasture about 20 miles from Montgomery, but they expanded sewer out there. And there are people within the town that they can do it for. In the rural communities, I think that we have to use this opportunity to enforce research and development, because a lot of these systems are failing that are being put in place now. And when we did our parasite study and we found evidence of hookworm, the people that had the highest percentage of hookworm were not the people that were straight piping. It was the people that had gotten engineered systems that were failing, and nobody was listening to them, because the narrative has become, the popular narrative is the people are not educated, so we need to come up with an educated system, a way a system of educating them on how to maintain them. Well, we can't maintain a lemon, and we got to put the kind of money into research and development to come up with systems that will work, because at the end of the day, when they fail, we're having these health disparities exacerbated. In Lowndes County, for an example, had the highest per capita infection and death rate from COVID than anywhere else in the state of Alabama. I'm not surprised because of what I've seen in Lowndes County. And we have to find ways in which to address this. So I think that the last point of action is to make sure that there are guardrails, that we don't have ambulance chasers who are in the engineering profession or installers that are putting in place systems that were failed. And I feel if you use federal money to put them in place, they should come with a service warranty and a guarantee that they're going to work at least 10 years. Now, and a lot of people are pushing back against it. I've been talking to folks that are in the industry, and they're pushing back against that. They don't want any warranties whatsoever. But why do we expect a warranty on a car, a warranty on an HVAC system? I'm building a house, a warranty on heating and cooling, a warranty on a tankless water heater, but we can't get a warranty on something that's so vital to our health, like the treatment of wastewater. So those are ways in which I think we should deal with it. And then lastly, what the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice is doing, we're not waiting on anybody else. We're going to change the engineering paradigm, and we're partnering with scientists and people from the community that have dealt with the failures to come up with solutions that will work. We want to take away sewers altogether, because what happens in the sewer generally ends up in the river. Look at Mount Vernon, New York, and what's happening there. That's one of our stories in the Guardian. So in order for us to find these solutions, we're gonna have to put the kind of effort into the technologies that we put into place to find a vaccine for a disease that we didn't even know existed 2 years ago. We could do the same thing with wastewater.
Boy, that's music to my ears. Let me just, one of the questions was around, and then there's a quick, let me first ask this one. First of all, do you see any bright lights out there? Communities that are doing this well with innovative technology that really can work for their communities and that is equitable in terms of how it's approached? And maybe, let me just,
let me answer, I can answer that question. No.
Right. Okay. All right.
I haven't seen it yet. I would like to see that, because what I'm seeing is, unfortunately, and this is why we have social justice issues over and over and over again, because we don't dig down deep enough to find out why these issues exist. And if we look at, for an example, when I was in Centerville in Illinois, and saw the same thing, I saw more raw sewage on the ground there outside of St. Louis than I did in Lowndes County. The people in Mount Vernon, New York, Westchester County is one of the richest counties in the U.S. And they're talking about the fact that their systems have failed over and over again. And the way in order to deal with it is to keep penalizing them, but not actually replacing the system. Jackson, Mississippi just had, because of a climate event, their system just broke down and failed. But look, we saw the same thing in Texas. When there was a climate event there, throughout Texas, the people not only lost power, they couldn't flush their toilets either, because I was getting emails from people as far south as San Antonio saying, Catherine, I understand what you're talking about, because we have a problem here too. So no, I have not seen it, because I think that it is informed a whole lot by inequalities that we, first of all, have not acknowledged exist. And until we acknowledge that, we're going to keep doing the same thing and making the same mistake over and over again.
Yeah, and there's some chat here in the chat here about people on who are watching today where they've been able to get warranties with their sewer lateral that they've put in, and so it does happen in some places. And I know you talk about in your book people who buy a home and then it turns out that the septic system isn't working at all, and they're liable for it after. So that there's no disclosure. It's not a normal disclosure in a home sale, which seems like that should be.
That's common in Alabama. Actually, one of the stories I tell is about a minister who was arrested in Pike County, Alabama, because the church bought the church that he was a part of bought a facility where they had separated the field lines from the septic tank. And when they separated the field lines from the septic tank, they sold him the part with the septic tank on it with no field lines. The adjacent landowner, who I suspect probably sold the property, the adjacent landowner was the one that went to the health department, filed a complaint. He was arrested because of this, and they were trying to get him to spend so much money to get a system that an individual system that was going to take him through a creek. That's why it was going to cost so much. Yet the person who filed the complaint had the sewer main on his property for the public sewer that existed. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of these inequalities that exist. And at the end of the day, it although they are trying to personalize it, and they were trying to put all the burden on the members of this church, at the end of the day, it was the environment that suffered. Because if the health department in that case should have used its resources not to prosecute the minister and have him arrested. He had never been arrested before, and he was in his 50s. Yeah. But yet they criminalized that instead of coming up with a solution that was much easier. In that case, the solution was connecting them to the wastewater, which was right there within 25 feet actually of the church.
Oh my God. Well, we're going to take one last question. I will just note in the chat, somebody asked about Camden, New Jersey being a bright spot, and there have been tremendous things that have happened in Camden, in large part because of the leadership of a guy named Andy Cricken, who gets mentioned in Catherine's book. But that's not really it's not the rural sewage situation, a small community thing that Catherine's talking about. But yeah.
The small community things are a little different, because what is happening even right now as I write about these things, and the failing septic system, the failing decentralized treatment system that's in Hayville, they're talking about replicating those systems throughout Alabama. It seems like people have no problem with, as long as they can get the money, the same people get the money. That's who I call the engineers that are like ambulance chasers that follow behind the stories that we tell, and they get the money to put in place the same thing. I feel that one of the solutions should be that we should put in place have a role of the Justice Department to prosecute people who take federal monies and put in place failing systems that jeopardize the health of everybody and the health of rivers.
Absolutely. And now we have about 2 minutes here. I don't know if you can, this may be a topic for a whole other webinar sometime, but there are a couple of people that have asked about promising designs. Another person has asked, if you move away from sewer, what are you moving towards? So this gets to a lot of this distributed and decentralized concepts that you have spent some time thinking about. I don't know if you can say anything quickly.
What I will say is that they're failing. That's what I will say.
So we're not there. Yeah, we don't have anything
yet. That's what my next book is about, because people from around the country are reporting that these systems are failing. Unfortunately, the industry will not accept that, and they want to keep forcing it as long as they're not putting it in their homes. I feel that if a person is going to promote a system, they should have to live with it for a few years themselves before they have to put it in somebody else's house and sell it to them. I think that would change that paradigm a lot.
Well, on that note, so we will keep our eyes open for the next book, and hopefully for some things even before that. Catherine, thank you so much for spending your, I don't know if it's morning or afternoon or whatever it is.
Morning.
with us. And thank you to everybody else who's joined, and hopefully this isn't the last that we hear from you.
And I like to quickly just say I'm accessible through public media, social media. So if you want to reach out to me, please do. You can check out our website, send a note there, and I will respond. Thank you.